Welcome and settle in. Tonight, we're going to take a slow walk through time, back to a village somewhere in medieval Europe, where the fields stretch out beyond the houses, and the rhythm of life is governed by seasons, harvests, and a diet that would challenge almost anyone living today. This is a story about what people ate when they had little choice, about how they survived on bread and grain and rare scraps of meat, and about why a modern person, dropped into that world and expected to live on that same diet, would face serious trouble. There's no drama here, no sudden shocks, just a calm exploration of history, food, and the fragile balance between survival and suffering in a world very different from ours. Section 1. Welcome to the medieval village. Picture a village in England, perhaps sometime in the 13th or 14th century, on a quiet morning when mist still hangs low over the fields and the first sounds are the shuffle of animals and the creak of a door opening somewhere down the row of cottages. This is a small settlement, maybe 60 or 70 people in total, clustered together in a loose collection of one-room timber houses with thatched roofs and walls made from wattle and daub, a mixture of woven sticks plastered over with mud, straw, animal dung, and sometimes a bit of lime or chalk if the household could find it. The houses are simple structures, often just a single rectangular room measuring roughly 16 feet by 12 feet, with an earthen floor, no glass in the windows, and a central hearth where smoke drifts upward toward a hole in the roof. There are no separate bedrooms, no kitchens in the modern sense, no private spaces. Everyone in the family sleeps, eats, and lives in that one room, sharing the space with stored grain, tools, and sometimes a few chickens or a pig brought inside for warmth or safety. The village sits at the center of its fields, which spread out in every direction under the open field system that defined rural life across much of medieval Europe. These are not small private plots fenced off by hedges. Instead, the arable land is divided into 2 or 3 enormous fields, each one covering hundreds of acres, and within each field the ground is broken up into long, narrow strips, each strip perhaps half an acre or an acre in size, assigned to different households. A single peasant family might work 20 or 30 of these strips scattered across the different fields, so that every household has a share of good soil and poor soil, wet ground and dry ground, ensuring that no one family is completely ruined if one part of the land fails. This system requires cooperation. Everyone plows at the same time, everyone sows the same crops in each field, and everyone harvests together, because the fields are open and animals graze on the stubble after the grain is cut. There are no fences between strips, just low ridges thrown up by the plow over years of turning the soil in the same direction, creating a gentle corrugated pattern across the landscape. The crops grown in these fields are almost entirely cereals and legumes. In a typical 3-field rotation, one field is planted in the autumn with winter grains such as wheat or rye, which will lie dormant under snow and then grow rapidly in spring to be harvested in summer. A second field is planted in spring with barley, oats, peas, or beans, which grow quickly and are harvested in late summer or early autumn. The third field is left fallow for a year, meaning nothing is planted and the soil rests, though animals are turned out onto it to graze and their manure helps restore some fertility. Each year the roles of the fields rotate so that every piece of land gets a year of rest every 3rd year. This system was a significant improvement over older 2-field rotations and helped support the population growth of the High Middle Ages, but it also locked villages into a narrow range of crops and made them deeply vulnerable to any disruption in the farming calendar. The villagers themselves are peasants, a term that covers a wide range of legal and economic statuses, but generally means people who work the land and owe labor, rents, or dues to a lord who controls the manor. Some are free tenants who pay rent in money or goods and have the legal right to leave if they choose, though in practice they rarely do because land and work are so tied to place. Others are serfs or villains, bound to the manor by custom and law, required to work a certain number of days each week on the lord's own fields, the domain, in addition to working their own strips. They cannot leave without permission, and their children inherit the same status. The social structure is rigid. At the top is the lord, who may live in a manor house near the village or in a distant castle, and who has the legal right to collect rents, fees, and labor services, to hold a court where disputes are settled and fines imposed, and to control access to resources like the mill, the oven, and the woods. Below the lord are the peasants, and below them, in some villages, a few landless cottagers who work as hired labourers or survive on tiny garden plots and whatever work they can find. The church stands near the centre of the village, a small stone building that is often the only permanent structure apart from the manor house. Its bells mark the hours of prayer and the rhythm of the day, and its priest is one of the few people in the village who can read and write. The churchyard is where the dead are buried, and the church itself is a gathering place on Sundays and feast days, a reminder that life in the village is not just about survival, but also about community, ritual, and a shared sense of place under the authority of both Lord and God. Life in this village revolves around the agricultural calendar. In late autumn and winter, after the harvest is in, there is a brief period of relative rest, though animals must still be tended, repairs made to tools and buildings, and firewood gathered. In spring, ploughing begins, and the whole village turns out to break the soil with heavy wooden ploughs pulled by oxen, if the community can afford them, or by teams of people if not. Seeds are broadcast by hand, and then the long wait begins, with weeding, watching the weather, and hoping that rain and sun come in the right balance. Summer brings the hay harvest from the meadows, which is critical for feeding animals through the winter, and then the grain harvest, the most intense and important period of the year, when every able-bodied person, including children, works from dawn to dusk cutting, binding, and carrying sheaves of wheat, barley, rye, and oats. After the harvest, grain must be threshed to separate the edible seeds from the chaff, winnowed to clean it, and stored in sacks or bins where it will feed the household through the coming year. This is the world that produced the medieval peasant diet. It is a world of hard labor, limited resources, and profound dependence on the success or failure of the harvest. In a good year, when the weather cooperates and the crops are abundant, a peasant household might have enough grain to make bread and pottage every day, enough ale to drink safely, and even a little surplus to sell or save. In a bad year, when rains are too heavy or drought too severe, when frost comes late or early, or when disease strikes the crops, the margin of survival narrows quickly, and hunger becomes a constant companion. The diet that sustained these villagers was not chosen for variety or pleasure. It was the product of what the land and the labor and the technology of the time could produce, and it was just barely enough, in most years, to keep people alive and working. For a modern person, accustomed to a wide variety of foods, to refrigeration and preservation technologies that keep produce fresh for weeks, to global supply chains that bring fruit from distant continents in the dead of winter, the medieval peasant's diet would seem not just monotonous, but genuinely dangerous. It was a diet built on grains, supplemented by legumes and root vegetables, with only occasional and small amounts of animal protein, and it was consumed in an environment where hygiene, sanitation, and food safety were concepts that did not yet exist in any modern sense. To understand why eating like a medieval peasant would be so risky today, we need to look closely at what was actually on the table, how meals were structured, what nutrients were present and what were missing, and what hidden dangers lurked in every bowl and loaf. That exploration begins with the core foods themselves, the staples that appeared day after day and season after season in the peasant household. Section 2. What was on the table? Core foods of a peasant. At the heart of the medieval peasant diet was grain, in quantities and forms that would astonish most modern eaters. Bread was not a side dish or an occasional treat. It was the single most important source of calories for the majority of the population, and a typical adult might consume 1.5 to 2 pounds of bread every single day, providing somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 calories just from that one food. The bread itself, however, was very different from the soft, fluffy loaves we know today. For peasants, bread was made from coarse flours milled from whatever grains were available and affordable, and that usually meant rye, barley, oats, or mixtures of grains known as maslin. Wheat was the preferred grain and produced the finest, whitest bread, but wheat was also the most expensive and was often reserved for the tables of lords and wealthy townspeople, or sold at market to raise cash. Peasants ate darker, denser breads that were heavy, chewy, and sometimes gritty with bits of bran and even small stones from the millstones used to grind the flour. The process of making bread began with threshing and winnowing the harvested grain, then taking it to the lord's mill, where a fee, usually a portion of the flour, was charged for grinding. The flour was mixed with water, salt if available, and a sourdough starter or balm from brewing, kneaded into a stiff dough, and shaped into large, round loaves that were baked in communal ovens or, in some households, on a griddle over the hearth. The loaves could weigh several pounds each and were meant to last for days, growing harder and drier as they aged, so that by the end of the week, a family might be gnawing on crusts that required soaking in pottage or ale to be edible. This bread was filling and provided significant energy, but it was also tough on teeth, difficult to digest for anyone not accustomed to it, and offered relatively little in the way of vitamins or protein compared with modern enriched or whole-grain breads. Alongside bread, the other fundamental element of the peasant diet was pottage, a thick, porridge-like stew that was eaten at nearly every meal and could be made from an almost infinite variety of ingredients depending on the season and what was available. The basic method was simple. A large iron or ceramic pot was hung over the fire, filled with water, and into it went grains such as barley, oats, or rye, along with dried peas, beans, or lentils, which were cheap, filling, and could be stored for months. The mixture was boiled for hours until it thickened into a dense, gluey mass that could be eaten with a spoon or scooped up with chunks of bread. To this base, a household might add whatever vegetables were on hand: onions, leeks, cabbages, turnips, parsnips, carrots, or herbs from the garden. In spring and summer, fresh greens and herbs provided some variety and a few vitamins. In autumn, root vegetables and the last of the harvest went into the pot. In winter, the pottage became simpler and blander, relying on stored grains and dried legumes with perhaps a bit of salted pork fat or bacon rind if the household had slaughtered a pig in the autumn. The pot itself was rarely emptied completely. Instead, new ingredients were added each day, and the mixture was kept simmering or reheated, so that pottage was an ongoing, evolving dish that carried flavors and textures forward from one meal to the next. This continuous cooking had some benefits. It broke down tough fibers in grains and legumes, making them easier to digest, and it killed some of the bacteria and parasites that might be present in water or vegetables. But it also meant that the pot could harbor spoilage and off flavors, and that the nutritional content of the pottage was unpredictable, depending entirely on what had been thrown in over the past days or weeks. Vegetables, as mentioned, came mostly from small garden plots near the peasant's house, where families grew cabbages, onions, leeks, garlic, peas, beans, turnips, parsnips, carrots, and various leafy greens. These gardens were tended by women and children and provided crucial supplements to the grain-based diet, adding fiber, some vitamins, and a bit of variety in flavor and texture. However, the range of vegetables was limited compared with modern gardens. Tomatoes, potatoes, peppers, and many other staples of today's tables were unknown in medieval Europe, as they had not yet been introduced from the Americas. Fruit was available seasonally, mostly apples, pears, plums, cherries, and berries gathered from hedgerows and orchards, but it was eaten fresh in late summer and autumn and otherwise dried or preserved, and it never formed a large part of the diet for most peasants. Fresh fruit was a treat, not a daily staple, and much of it went to make cider or other fermented drinks. Animal products, the foods modern nutritionists emphasize for protein and essential fats, were present in the medieval peasant diet, but only in small and irregular amounts. Meat was expensive and required either raising animals, which took time, feed, and resources, or purchasing it at market, which cost money that most peasants did not have. A typical peasant household might keep a pig, which could be fattened on scraps and acorns and slaughtered in late autumn, providing several months' worth of salted or smoked pork and bacon. They might also keep chickens for eggs, and occasionally a chicken too old to lay would end up in the pot. But fresh meat from cattle, sheep, or goats was rare on the peasant's table, appearing mostly at major feast days such as Christmas or Easter, or after communal events like harvest festivals where a lord might provide a meal. Game animals such as deer and rabbits were legally the property of the lord, and hunting them without permission was poaching, a crime that could result in harsh penalties. Fish provided another potential source of animal protein, especially in regions near rivers, lakes, or the sea, and particularly during the many fast days mandated by the church calendar, when eating meat was forbidden but fish was allowed. Salted or dried fish, especially herring and cod, became important trade goods and appeared in peasant diets, though they were often expensive relative to grains, and their heavy salt content posed its own health challenges. Freshwater fish such as eels, pike, and trout were caught in streams and ponds, and eels in particular were common and cheap in some areas. Dairy products such as milk, butter, and cheese were more common than meat in many regions, especially in pastoral areas where cattle and sheep were kept for wool and milk rather than slaughter. Cheese was a valuable food because it could be preserved for months, providing concentrated protein and fat through the winter when fresh milk was scarce. However, dairy was not universal, and in some parts of Europe, especially where lactose intolerance was more common or where cattle were too valuable to be milked, peasants consumed very little dairy at all. Finally, there were the fats and flavors that made food palatable. Butter and lard were used when available, but they were precious and used sparingly. Olive oil was common in Mediterranean regions, but rare and expensive in Northern Europe. Salt was essential for preserving meat and fish, but it was also costly and tightly controlled, often subject to taxes and monopolies. Spices such as pepper, cinnamon, ginger, and cloves were luxury items, far beyond the reach of ordinary peasants, who had to content themselves with local herbs like parsley, thyme, sage, and mustard. Sweetness came from honey, the only widely available sweetener before the later expansion of sugar imports. But honey, too, was a semi-luxury, and most peasant meals were simply not sweet at all. This, then, was the core of what a medieval peasant ate: bread made from coarse grains, pottage of barley and beans, garden vegetables in season, occasional eggs or a bit of cheese, rare scraps of pork or salted fish, and almost nothing in the way of sugar, spices, or imported foods. It was a diet that could sustain life, and for many people it did, supporting populations that grew steadily through the 12th and 13th centuries. But it was also a diet that left little room for error, that provided only the barest nutritional minimum in most years, and that would subject a modern person, unaccustomed to its monotony and its hidden dangers, to a host of digestive, metabolic, and infectious challenges that could quickly turn serious. To understand how these foods were actually consumed, we need to look at the structure of medieval meals and the central role of one more substance that appeared on the table every single day: ale. Section 3. Bread, pottage, and ale. How meals actually worked. In the medieval peasant household, the rhythm of eating was simpler and less formalized than the 3 meals a day structure familiar to modern people. Most peasants ate 2 main meals, although the timing and content varied by season, workload, and availability of food. The first meal of the day was taken sometime in the late morning, after several hours of work in the fields or around the house, and it typically consisted of bread, perhaps dipped in ale or pottage, and possibly a piece of cheese or a handful of cold pottage left over from the previous day. This was not a leisurely breakfast, but a functional pause for fuel eaten quickly while standing or sitting on a bench near the hearth. The main meal of the day came in the early afternoon, after the heaviest work was done, and this was when the pottage pot came into its own. The family gathered around the fire, and each person was given a bowl or a wooden trencher, a thick slab of stale bread that served as an edible plate, and the pottage was ladled out, thick and steaming, along with more fresh bread if there was any. Everyone ate with spoons or their hands, and there was no particular ceremony or variation. The meal was the same day after day: grain and legumes, bread, and whatever vegetables or scraps of fat could be added. On special occasions, a feast day or after a successful harvest, there might be meat in the pottage or a separate dish of roasted pork or fish, and these moments were remembered and talked about precisely because they were so rare. In the evening, if there was a third meal at all, it was lighter, often just more bread and ale, perhaps with an onion or a piece of cheese. During the winter, when daylight was short and fuel for heating and cooking was precious, many households ate only twice a day and went to bed early to save on firewood and candles. In summer, when days were long and work was intense, people might eat more frequently, taking bread and ale out to the fields for a midday break. The important thing to understand is that meals were not about variety or enjoyment. They were about getting enough calories to keep working, and the same foods appeared meal after meal, week after week, month after month, with only seasonal variation to break the monotony. And then there was ale. To modern ears, it might sound strange to learn that medieval peasants, including children, drank ale as their primary daily beverage. But this was not the strong, heavily hopped beer familiar today. It was a different drink altogether, known as small ale or small beer, with an alcohol content of perhaps 2 to 3%, roughly half that of modern beers. This weak ale was brewed in large batches in the home or by a village alewife, a woman who brewed for sale, using malted barley or oats, water, and sometimes a handful of herbs for flavor before hops became common. The key to understanding why ale was so important lies in the brewing process itself. Boiling the water during brewing killed many of the bacteria and parasites that made untreated water dangerous to drink. The alcohol, even in small amounts, provided additional antimicrobial protection, and the calories from the residual sugars and grains in the ale added to the drinker's energy intake. How much ale did a medieval peasant actually drink? Estimates vary, but records from monasteries, manors, and urban households suggest that adults consumed somewhere between 1 and 2 liters per day, and sometimes more during heavy work periods. That might sound like a lot, but given the low alcohol content and the unsafe nature of most water sources, ale was simply the practical choice for hydration. Children also drank ale, though possibly in smaller amounts, and this was considered perfectly normal. The alternative, drinking from rivers, streams, and wells that were often contaminated by runoff from fields fertilized with human and animal manure, was far more dangerous. Ale was not a luxury or an indulgence. It was a necessity, a basic component of the diet that provided hydration, calories, and some measure of safety in a world where clean water was scarce. The seasonal variation in the peasant diet was another critical aspect of how meals worked. In late summer and autumn, after the grain harvest, food was relatively abundant. There was fresh bread from the new wheat and barley, vegetables from the gardens, fruit from the orchards, and perhaps fresh meat if a pig or sheep had been slaughtered. This was the time of year when peasants could eat their fill, repair their strength after the exhausting labor of harvest, and even set aside some stores for the coming winter. Autumn was also the season for brewing, as the new grain was turned into ale that would keep through the cold months. Winter brought a gradual tightening of the diet. Fresh vegetables disappeared, and meals relied more heavily on stored grains, dried legumes, salted or smoked meat if any remained, and root vegetables like turnips and parsnips kept in cold cellars. Bread might be made from older, lower-quality grain as the best was eaten first, and pottage became thinner and blander as stocks ran low. Ale was still brewed, but if grain was scarce, it might be weaker or made from inferior ingredients. By late winter and early spring, the period known as the Hungry Gap, many peasant households were down to the last of their stores, eating bread made from the coarsest flour, pottage of dried peas and beans, and whatever they could forage from the countryside, wild greens, roots, nuts from the previous autumn, and herbs. This was the most dangerous time of year, when malnutrition weakened people and made them vulnerable to disease, and when a late frost or a failed spring planting could spell disaster. Spring brought some relief as new plants began to grow and animals that had been kept through the winter began to produce milk again. But the main harvest was still months away, and the gap between the end of winter stores and the arrival of new crops was a recurring crisis in the medieval agricultural calendar. This seasonal cycle meant that a medieval peasant's diet was never static. It fluctuated wildly between relative plenty and near starvation, and the long-term health effects of this pattern, cycling between adequate nutrition and deficiency, were profound. For a modern person trying to live on this diet, the shock would begin almost immediately. The sheer quantity of coarse bread and heavy pottage, the lack of variety, the absence of fruits and vegetables for much of the year, and the reliance on weak ale as the primary drink would be difficult enough. But the real problems would emerge over weeks and months as the body began to suffer from the lack of nutrients that the medieval diet simply could not provide in consistent amounts, and as exposure to contamination and parasites inherent in a food system with no modern sanitation or safety controls began to take its toll. To understand what would go wrong, we need to look at the diet through the lens of modern nutrition and ask a simple question. Would you be fed, or would you be failing? Section 4. Calories, nutrients, and deficiencies. Would you be fed or failing? From a modern nutritional perspective, the medieval peasant diet presents a complex and somewhat paradoxical picture. On one hand, in an average year with a successful harvest, a working peasant could consume a significant number of calories, enough to support the intense physical labor that filled their days. Estimates based on manor records, food allowances, and historical accounts suggest that an adult male peasant engaged in heavy agricultural work might have consumed somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000 calories per day, with women and children consuming somewhat less depending on their size and activity level. The bulk of these calories came from carbohydrates, primarily in the form of bread and pottage made from grains and legumes. A pound and a half of bread alone could provide 1,500 calories, and a large bowl of thick barley and pea pottage might add another 500 to 1,000 calories, depending on its density and ingredients. Add in the calories from ale, perhaps 200 to 300 per day, and from occasional cheese, eggs, or scraps of meat, and the total energy intake could reach levels that would seem quite high to a modern sedentary person. The problem, however, is not just the total number of calories, but their quality and balance. The medieval peasant diet was overwhelmingly dominated by a single macronutrient: carbohydrates from grains. Wheat, rye, barley, and oats are all rich in starch, and when combined with legumes like peas and beans, which also contain significant carbohydrates along with some protein, the result was a diet that could be as much as 70 to 80% carbohydrate by total calories. Protein, essential for maintaining muscle mass, repairing tissues, and supporting immune function, was present but often marginal. Legumes, bread made from whole grains, and occasional cheese or eggs provided some protein, but the total intake was likely in the range of 50 to 70 grams per day for an adult, which is at or below modern recommended levels, especially for someone doing hard physical labor. Animal protein, the most complete source in terms of essential amino acids, was scarce, and vegetable proteins from grains and legumes are less efficiently absorbed and lack some amino acids, meaning that the effective protein nutrition of the medieval diet was probably marginal for many people. Fats, the third macronutrient and a critical source of energy and essential fatty acids, were in even shorter supply. The medieval peasant diet was, by modern standards, extremely low in fat. Butter, lard, and cheese were the main sources, but they were used sparingly because they were valuable and often sold or saved for special occasions. Meat, when it did appear, provided some fat, but the animals themselves were often lean because they were not fattened in the way modern livestock are. The result was a diet that might derive only 10 to 15% of its calories from fat, far below the 30 to 40% typical of modern Western diets. For a person adapted over a lifetime to this pattern, the body could adjust, using carbohydrates for energy and conserving fats carefully. But for a modern person, especially one accustomed to higher fat intake, the sudden shift to such a low-fat diet could cause feelings of constant hunger, difficulty maintaining body weight, and problems with the absorption of fat-soluble vitamins. Which brings us to the micronutrients, the vitamins and minerals that are present in food in tiny amounts but are absolutely essential for health. This is where the medieval peasant diet begins to show serious cracks. Vitamin C, necessary for immune function, wound healing, and the prevention of scurvy, was available in the medieval diet primarily from fresh vegetables and fruits. In summer and autumn, when gardens were producing and fruit was in season, peasants could get adequate vitamin C from cabbages, onions, leeks, apples, and berries. But in winter and early spring, fresh produce disappeared, and the diet shifted to stored grains, dried legumes, and root vegetables, many of which lose their vitamin C content during storage. There is some evidence that medieval Europeans did suffer from mild scurvy during the late winter months, with symptoms like bleeding gums, easy bruising, and fatigue, although full-blown scurvy, the kind that killed sailors on long sea voyages, was probably rare because spring greens and new growth appeared before deficiency became fatal. Vitamin A, important for vision, immune function, and skin health, comes from animal products like liver, eggs, and dairy, and from orange and yellow vegetables like carrots. The medieval diet provided some vitamin A from cheese, occasional eggs, and carrots, but levels were likely marginal, and deficiency could lead to night blindness and increased susceptibility to infections. Vitamin D, synthesized in the skin in response to sunlight, was probably adequate in summer for people who worked outdoors all day, but in the long, dark winters of northern Europe, deficiency was likely common, contributing to bone problems and weakened immunity. The B vitamins, a complex group essential for energy metabolism and nerve function, were present in whole grains and legumes, so the medieval diet was probably adequate in most B vitamins, although the milling process that removed bran could reduce levels of some B vitamins in white bread, a concern mainly for wealthier people who could afford refined flour. Iron, critical for carrying oxygen in the blood, was a particular problem, especially for women. The main sources of iron in the medieval diet were whole grains, legumes, and leafy green vegetables, all of which contain non-heme iron that is less readily absorbed by the body than the heme iron found in red meat. Women of childbearing age, who lose iron through menstruation and face increased demands during pregnancy and breastfeeding, were at high risk of iron deficiency anemia, which causes fatigue, weakness, and increased vulnerability to infection. Archaeological studies of medieval skeletons have found evidence of anemia in a significant proportion of individuals, particularly women and children, suggesting that iron deficiency was a chronic problem. For a modern woman placed on a medieval peasant diet, especially if she did not have access to iron supplements or fortified foods, anemia could develop within months, sapping energy and making the heavy physical labor of peasant life even more exhausting. Calcium, necessary for strong bones and teeth, was available from dairy products, but as noted earlier, dairy consumption varied widely by region and household. In areas where cheese and milk were common, calcium intake was probably adequate. In areas where dairy was scarce, people relied on the calcium in leafy greens, legumes, and the small bones of fish, which was often insufficient, leading to weaker bones and a higher risk of fractures, a serious problem in a world without modern orthopedic medicine. Iodine, essential for thyroid function, was scarce in inland areas far from the sea, and goiter, the swelling of the thyroid gland caused by iodine deficiency, was recognized as a common problem in some medieval regions. So, to answer the question posed at the start of this section, would you be fed or would you be failing? In one sense, you might be fed. If you were dropped into a medieval peasant household in a year of good harvest, you would receive enough calories to avoid outright starvation. And if you worked as hard as a medieval peasant, you might even maintain your weight and strength for a time. But in another, more important sense, you would be failing, slowly and quietly. The lack of dietary diversity, the marginal protein and fat intake, the seasonal deficiencies in vitamins and minerals, and the absence of foods rich in nutrients like iron, calcium, and vitamin C would gradually undermine your health. You might not notice it in the first weeks or even months, but over time you would become more tired, more prone to illness, slower to heal from injuries, and more vulnerable to infections. And if you were a woman, or if you had any underlying health condition, or if you simply were not as physically conditioned as someone who had worked in the fields since childhood, the diet's inadequacies would hit you even harder. But even these nutritional shortcomings, serious as they are only part of the story. The medieval peasant diet was not just deficient in certain nutrients. It was also, by modern standards, shockingly unsafe, contaminated with pathogens, parasites, and toxins that modern food safety regulations and sanitation systems have largely eliminated from the contemporary food supply. It is to these hidden dangers that we now turn, because they represent perhaps the greatest immediate threat to a modern person trying to survive on a medieval diet. Section 5. Hidden Dangers: Contamination, Parasites, and Food Safety. If the nutritional deficiencies of the medieval peasant diet would slowly wear you down over months and years, the contamination and parasites would begin to make you sick far more quickly. Medieval Europe had no concept of germ theory, no understanding of bacteria, viruses, or parasitic worms as agents of disease. Illness was attributed to imbalances in the body's humors, to bad air or miasma, to sin, or to the will of God. And while some practical measures for avoiding spoiled food existed, they were based on experience and observation rather than scientific understanding. The result was a food system and a living environment that were, from a modern microbiological perspective, profoundly unsafe. Begin with water, the most basic necessity. As discussed earlier, most medieval peasants did not drink plain water because it was often contaminated. Rivers, streams, and wells were easily polluted by runoff from fields that had been fertilized with human and animal manure, by waste from households and workshops, and by the decomposition of organic matter. In towns and cities, the situation was even worse, with streets serving as open sewers and water sources located downstream from latrines and industrial sites. Drinking such water could lead to immediate gastrointestinal illness, diarrhea, vomiting, and dehydration, and repeated exposure could introduce parasites and chronic infections. The practice of drinking ale instead of water was, in effect, a practical public health measure, even though no one at the time understood it in those terms. But ale was not consumed exclusively, and vegetables, especially leafy greens and roots, were often washed in the same contaminated water or grown in soil fertilized with human feces, a practice known as night soil farming that was common in and around cities and villages. This created a direct route for parasites and pathogens to enter the food chain. Archaeological studies of medieval latrines, cesspits, and grave sites have provided vivid evidence of just how common parasitic infections were. Analysis of preserved fecal material and of soil samples from latrine pits has identified eggs and cysts of numerous parasites, including roundworm Ascaris lumbricoides, whipworm Trichuris trichiura, tapeworms, Taenia species, liver flukes, Fasciola hepatica, and protozoa such as Giardia and Entamoeba. These are not rare finds. In many medieval sites, the prevalence of parasitic eggs suggests that the majority of the population was infected with one or more species of intestinal worms. Roundworm, one of the most common, is transmitted when eggs from human feces contaminate food or water and are ingested. The eggs hatch in the intestine, and the larvae migrate through the body, eventually returning to the gut where they mature into adult worms that can grow to the length of a pencil. Heavy infections can cause abdominal pain, malnutrition, and intestinal blockages, and in children, chronic roundworm infection is associated with stunted growth and cognitive impairment. Whipworm infections, also transmitted through fecal contamination, cause chronic diarrhea, anemia, and rectal prolapse in severe cases. Tapeworms, acquired by eating undercooked or raw meat from infected animals, live in the intestine and absorb nutrients meant for the host, leading to weight loss, abdominal discomfort, and vitamin deficiencies. Liver flukes, contracted from eating watercress or other aquatic plants contaminated with cysts, infect the liver and bile ducts, causing chronic inflammation, pain, and in the long term, serious liver damage. For a modern person, who has likely never been exposed to these parasites and whose immune system is not primed to control them, the impact of a medieval parasite load could be severe. Initial infections might cause intense gastrointestinal symptoms, diarrhea, cramping, nausea, and vomiting. As the parasites established themselves, chronic symptoms would set in: persistent digestive discomfort, malabsorption of nutrients leading to deficiencies even if food intake was adequate, anemia from blood loss in the gut, fatigue, and a general sense of unwellness. Some parasites also cause systemic symptoms as larvae migrate through the lungs or other organs, leading to coughing, wheezing, and fever. Modern treatments for parasitic infections exist, but in the medieval period there were none that were reliably effective, and people simply lived with their worms, often for years, the parasites quietly draining their health and strength. Beyond parasites, there were bacterial and viral pathogens. Foodborne bacteria such as Salmonella, E. coli, and Campylobacter thrive in environments with poor sanitation and can contaminate meat, dairy, and vegetables. In the medieval period, meat was often poorly preserved, stored at ambient temperatures, and handled without concern for cross-contamination. Dairy products, especially milk, spoiled quickly and could carry a range of pathogens. A modern person eating medieval food would be exposed to these bacteria repeatedly, leading to frequent bouts of food poisoning, some mild and some potentially serious, especially for anyone with a weakened immune system. There was also the danger of spoilage and natural toxins in food. Grain stored for months in damp conditions could develop mold, and some molds produce mycotoxins that cause illness. One of the most dangerous was ergot, a fungus that infects rye and produces alkaloids that are toxic to humans. Ergotism, known in the medieval period as St. Antony's fire, caused symptoms ranging from convulsions, hallucinations, and gangrene of the extremities to death, and outbreaks were documented throughout medieval Europe, especially in years when wet weather favored the growth of the fungus. While peasants learned to recognize badly infected grain and avoid it when possible in times of famine, when food was scarce, people ate whatever was available, including grain that would normally be discarded, and ergot poisoning was one of the grim consequences. Vegetables and fruits could also harbor toxins. Potatoes and tomatoes, which are nightshades and contain natural toxins, were not present in medieval Europe, but other plants that were eaten, such as certain wild greens and roots foraged during times of hunger, could be mildly toxic or cause digestive upset if not prepared properly. The lack of knowledge about food safety meant that trial and error, and sometimes tragedy, were the ways people learned what was safe to eat. For a modern person, the cumulative effect of all these hazards, contaminated water and vegetables, parasitic infections, bacterial pathogens, and occasional exposure to natural toxins, would be a constant state of mild to moderate illness. Digestive problems would be chronic. Energy levels would be low, not just from poor nutrition, but from the metabolic cost of fighting infections and supporting a population of intestinal parasites. Immune function would be compromised, making you more susceptible to other diseases, and any injury or illness that required robust immune response, such as a wound infection or a respiratory infection, would be more likely to become serious or even fatal. In a world without antibiotics, antiparasitic drugs, or intravenous rehydration therapy, even a bad case of diarrhea from contaminated food could be life-threatening if it led to severe dehydration. Medieval peasants, of course, did not all die from these exposures because they developed some level of immunity and tolerance over their lifetimes. Children were exposed to parasites and pathogens from infancy, and those who survived to adulthood had immune systems that, while not able to eliminate the threats entirely, could keep them in check well enough to allow a life of hard work. But the cost was high. Infant and child mortality was staggering by modern standards, with perhaps 30 to 50% of children dying before the age of 5, many from infections and malnutrition. Those who survived often carried chronic infections, showed signs of stunted growth and malnutrition in their bones, and had shorter lifespans than people in well-nourished modern populations. For you, a modern adult dropped into this environment without that lifetime of exposure and adaptation, the risks would be immediate and serious. And if the regular diet, with all its contamination, was not enough of a challenge, there were also the years when the system broke down entirely, when harvests failed and hunger became famine, and when the already fragile balance between survival and death tipped decisively toward death. It is to those famine years that we now turn. Section 6, Famine Years, when the diet collapsed. In an average year, with decent weather and no major disasters, the medieval peasant diet, for all its deficiencies and dangers, was at least sufficient to keep people alive and working. But medieval agriculture was fragile, utterly dependent on the weather, and vulnerable to a range of shocks that could turn abundance into scarcity with terrifying speed. A late frost in spring could kill the new shoots of wheat and barley. A wet summer could rot the grain in the fields before it could be harvested. A dry autumn could prevent the planting of winter crops. Livestock diseases could wipe out herds of cattle, sheep, or pigs, eliminating sources of meat, dairy, and labor. And when these disasters struck not in isolation, but in succession, year after year, the result was famine, a catastrophe that could kill tens of thousands of people and reshape the social and economic landscape of entire regions. Most devastating example in the medieval period was the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, an event that struck northern Europe and is remembered as one of the worst subsistence crises of the Middle Ages. The famine was triggered by a dramatic change in weather patterns. Beginning in the spring of 1315, heavy rains began to fall across much of northern Europe, and they continued, with little break, through the summer and into the autumn. Fields became waterlogged. Seeds rotted in the ground before they could germinate. The grain that did grow was attacked by mold and fungus. Hay for feeding livestock could not be dried and spoiled in the fields. The harvest in 1315 was disastrously poor, perhaps only a fraction of a normal year's yield. Peasants and lords alike looked to their stored grain from the previous year, hoping to make it stretch. But the rains continued into 1316, and the second harvest was as bad or worse than the first. By the winter of 1316, food stocks were critically low across the region. The effects of the famine were immediate and brutal. Grain prices, which in normal years were stable and predictable, soared to many times their usual levels as supplies dried up and desperate people bid against each other for what little was available. Peasants who had sold their surplus in better years to pay rents and buy necessities now found themselves unable to afford bread at market. Those who had stored some grain were forced to eat through it faster than planned, grinding and baking inferior flours from barley, oats, and even mixtures that included bran, chaff, and seeds normally fed to animals. As stocks ran lower, people turned to substitutes, acorns, roots, bark, and wild plants that would not normally be considered food. Some chronicles from the period report that people ate cats, dogs, and even, in the most horrific accounts, resorted to cannibalism, though such reports are difficult to verify and may have been exaggerated to emphasize the severity of the crisis. Livestock suffered as badly as humans. With hay rotted and grain too precious to spare for animals, cattle, sheep, pigs, and horses died in large numbers from starvation and disease. The loss of draft animals meant that ploughing and planting in the spring of 1317 was even more difficult, creating a vicious cycle where reduced planting led to reduced harvests, perpetuating the famine. The death of animals also eliminated sources of meat, milk, and cheese, making the diet even more restricted. Human mortality during the Great Famine is estimated to have been in the range of 10 to 25% of the population in the most severely affected areas, with the poor, the very young, and the elderly suffering the highest death rates. People died not only from outright starvation, but from the diseases that flourish when populations are weakened by malnutrition: dysentery, typhus, and respiratory infections. The weakened condition of survivors left them vulnerable for years afterward, and it has been suggested that the Great Famine contributed to the severity of the Black Death when it arrived a generation later, because the population was still recovering and less able to resist the plague. The Great Famine was not a unique event. Local and regional famines occurred throughout the medieval period, triggered by droughts, floods, frosts, wars that disrupted farming, and epidemics among livestock. The system had no buffer. Most peasant households had little or no surplus, and in a bad year there was no fallback. Towns and cities, which depended on the countryside for food, could be cut off and starve even when rural areas had some resources, and the mechanisms for distributing aid, such as they were limited to the charity of the church and the occasional intervention of lords who had a vested interest in keeping their tenants alive to work the land. For a modern person placed into this scenario, the experience of famine would be almost unimaginable. In normal times, the medieval diet, inadequate as it was, at least provided calories. In a famine year, those calories would drop sharply, perhaps to half or even a third of what was needed to maintain weight and health. Within weeks, you would begin to lose weight rapidly, burning through fat stores and then muscle tissue as your body desperately sought energy. Hunger would be constant and overwhelming, a physical pain that dominated every thought. As malnutrition deepened, your immune system would collapse, leaving you vulnerable to every passing infection. Wounds would heal slowly or not at all. Minor illnesses would become serious. Mental function would decline as the brain was starved of glucose. Eventually, if the famine continued and no relief came, your body would simply shut down, too weak to fight infection, to digest food even if it became available, or to maintain the basic functions of life. Medieval peasants, who had grown up in a world where hunger was never far away and who had weathered bad harvests before, might have had slightly better psychological resilience to famine, though of course many did not survive. But for someone from the modern world, where food security is taken for granted and malnutrition is a distant concept, the shock would be profound and the decline swift. This is why the question posed by this script, whether you would die eating a medieval peasant's diet, is not hypothetical. In a famine year, the answer would almost certainly be yes, unless you had access to outside help, charity, or stored resources that the average medieval peasant did not possess. Even in years that were not full famines, the seasonal scarcity of late winter and spring, the hungry gap, would be a serious trial for a modern person unaccustomed to prolonged caloric restriction and the psychological stress of not knowing when the next adequate meal would come. The medieval peasant had no safety net, no emergency services, no government food aid. Survival depended entirely on the harvest, on what had been stored, and on the strength and resilience built up over a lifetime of hard work and adaptation. For someone without that background, the risk of malnutrition severe enough to cause lasting harm or death would be very real, even in a year that medieval standards would consider merely poor rather than catastrophic. But let us return now to the more typical years, the times when food was scarce but not absent, and consider the moments of relief, the occasions when the medieval peasant diet included something more than bread, pottage, and ale, the rare appearances of meat and fish that broke the monotony and provided a welcome, if temporary, boost to nutrition and morale. Section 7. Meat, fish, and festive exceptions. Rare relief. The image of the medieval feast, with whole roasted animals, platters piled high with meat, and rivers of wine and ale, is one of the most enduring pictures of the Middle Ages. And such feasts did happen, particularly in the great halls of lords and in monasteries, where records show astonishing quantities of food consumed on special occasions. But for the average peasant, these grand feasts were not part of everyday life. Meat, in particular, was a rarity, something that appeared on the table only a few times a year, and the occasions when it did were marked as special, times of celebration or religious observance that punctuated the otherwise relentless routine of grain and vegetables. The most common source of meat for a peasant household was the pig. Pigs were ideal animals for small-scale farming because they could be fed on scraps, foraged in woods for acorns and roots, and required relatively little care compared with cattle or sheep. A household that could afford to raise a pig through the spring and summer would slaughter it in the autumn, traditionally around November, a month sometimes known as Blood Month, because it was the time when animals that could not be kept through the winter were killed and their meat preserved. The slaughter of a pig was a major event, and every part of the animal was used. Fresh pork was eaten immediately, often shared with neighbors and kin in a brief period of abundance. The rest was salted, smoked, or made into sausages, and the preserved meat, particularly bacon and ham, would be rationed out over the coming months, added in small amounts to pottage or eaten on feast days. Even so, by late winter or early spring, the preserved pork would often be gone, and the household would return to a meat-free diet until the next autumn. Chickens provided another source of animal protein, though primarily in the form of eggs rather than meat. A hen that was still laying eggs was too valuable to kill, and chickens were eaten only when they stopped producing or when a special occasion demanded it. Eggs, when available, were a welcome addition to the diet, providing high-quality protein and fats, and they could be boiled, fried, or added to pottage and baked goods. But the supply of eggs was seasonal, peaking in spring and summer and dropping off in winter when hens laid less frequently or not at all. Beef and mutton, the meat of cattle and sheep, were much less common on the peasant's table. Cattle were too valuable as draft animals, used to pull ploughs and carts, and as sources of milk and leather, to be slaughtered for meat, except in old age or when they became injured or sick. Sheep were raised primarily for their wool, which was one of medieval Europe's most important commodities, and again, only old or unproductive animals were typically eaten. When beef or mutton did appear, it was often at communal feasts organized by the lord or at church festivals, and these occasions were remembered precisely because they were so unusual. In the later medieval period, particularly after the Black Death reduced the population and increased wages and food availability, peasants and laborers began to eat more meat, and records from the 15th century show that harvest workers, for example, received meals that included significant amounts of mutton and beef as part of their wages. But even then, daily meat consumption remained far below modern levels, and for most of the medieval period, the typical peasant ate meat only a handful of times per year. Fish, however, played a more regular and important role, especially in regions near the coast or major rivers, and particularly because of the Christian calendar's rules about fasting. The medieval church mandated that meat from warm-blooded animals could not be eaten on Fridays, during the 40 days of Lent before Easter, on the vigils of major feast days, and during Advent before Christmas. These fast days, which could add up to more than 100 days per year, were supposed to be observed by everyone, from kings to peasants, though enforcement and compliance varied. On fast days, fish was permitted, and this created a massive demand for preserved fish that could be stored and transporting over long distances. The two most important fish in the medieval diet were herring and cod. Herring, a small, oily fish found in enormous schools in the North Sea and the Baltic, could be caught in huge quantities during the spawning season and was preserved by salting or smoking. Salted herring became one of the great trade commodities of medieval Europe, shipped in barrels from fishing ports to towns and cities across the continent. It was cheap, at least compared with meat, and provided protein and fats that were otherwise scarce in the peasant diet. Cod, a larger fish found in the cold waters of the North Atlantic, was preserved by drying, a process that produced stockfish, rock-hard slabs of dried fish that could be stored for years and rehydrated by soaking in water before cooking. Stockfish was another staple of the medieval fish trade, and it too appeared on peasant tables, particularly during Lent. In addition to these preserved sea fish, freshwater fish such as eels, pike, perch, and trout were caught in rivers, lakes, and ponds, and in some regions, particularly where landlords maintained fish ponds as part of their estates, fresh fish was more readily available. Eels were especially common and cheap in areas with rivers and marshes, and they appear frequently in records of peasant diets and in payments of rent in kind. Fish, whether salt herring, dried cod, or freshwater eels, thus provided an important supplement to the grain-based diet, offering protein and some fats, and breaking the monotony of endless pottage and bread. But even with these additions, the overall pattern of the medieval peasant diet remained clear. The vast majority of calories came from grains. Most days saw no animal products at all, except perhaps a bit of cheese or an egg, and the moments when meat or a decent portion of fish appeared on the table were few and far between, marked as special and remembered as relief from the normal routine. Feast days such as Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, and the feast of the local patron saint were the times when communities came together, when lords might provide a meal for their tenants, when a household's stored meat was brought out, and when, for a day or two, people could eat their fill and enjoy foods that were otherwise out of reach. These feasts served important social functions, reinforcing bonds between lord and peasant, celebrating the rhythms of the agricultural and religious year, and providing a psychological respite from the hard labor and limited diet of everyday life. For a modern person trying to live on a medieval peasant's diet, these occasional meals of meat or fish would be welcome, certainly, but they would not fundamentally change the nutritional calculus. A few days of higher protein intake per year cannot make up for months of marginal nutrition, and the preserved meats and fish, heavily salted and often partially spoiled, would bring their own problems, including excessive sodium intake, potential toxins from spoilage, and the same risks of contamination that plagued the rest of the food supply. The feast would provide a temporary boost, but the return to bread and pottage would be all the more stark afterward, and the long-term deficiencies and exposures would continue to accumulate. Yet for all of this, medieval peasants did survive, and some even thrived within the limits of their world. They worked hard, they adapted to what was available, and their bodies and lifestyles were shaped by the food they ate and the labor they performed in ways that a modern person with a very different physical conditioning and metabolic profile would find difficult to replicate. To understand why the medieval diet worked for them, at least well enough to sustain a population that grew significantly in the high Middle Ages, we need to look at the relationship between diet, workload, and the long-term physical adaptation that began in childhood and continued throughout life. Section 8, Workload Lifestyle, and why the diet worked for them. One of the most important things to understand about the medieval peasant diet is that it did not exist in isolation. It was part of a complete lifestyle, a way of living that shaped the body from infancy and that made demands and provided conditioning that are almost unimaginable to most people today. The diet, inadequate and monotonous as it was by modern standards, was paired with a level of physical activity that was extraordinary, and this combination of high-calorie intake from carbohydrates and constant, strenuous labor created a kind of equilibrium that allowed most people, in most years, to survive and function, even if they were never truly thriving in the way modern nutrition science would define health. The working life of a medieval peasant began early, often in childhood. By the age of 5 or 6, children were helping with light tasks around the house and the fields, tending chickens, weeding gardens, carrying water, and learning the skills they would need as adults. By the time they reached adolescence, they were working full days alongside their parents, plowing, sowing, harvesting, threshing, and caring for animals. This early start meant that their bodies developed under the stress of physical labor, their muscles, bones, and cardiovascular systems adapting to the demands placed on them. They did not go to school, they did not have hours of sedentary leisure, and they did not grow up in environments where food was abundant and varied. Their bodies learned to function on the diet that was available, and those who could not adapt, who were too weak or too sick to keep up, often did not survive to adulthood. For those who did survive, the typical working day was long and physically demanding. Peasants rose with the sun, often around dawn, and worked until dusk, with only brief breaks for meals. The nature of the work varied by season, but it was almost always strenuous. Ploughing, done by guiding a heavy wooden plough pulled by oxen or by hand with a team of people, was back-breaking labor that could go on for days or weeks in the spring planting season. Harvesting, which involved bending over to cut grain with a sickle, binding the sheaves, and carrying them to the threshing floor, was exhausting and had to be done quickly before the grain was lost to weather or animals. Threshing, the process of beating the harvested grain with flails to separate the seeds from the stalks, was repetitive and tiring. Haymaking, the cutting and drying of grass for winter fodder, was another intense period of work that required entire communities to turn out and labor together. In addition to field work, there were the daily tasks of maintaining the household, caring for animals, repairing tools and buildings, gathering firewood, fetching water, cooking, spinning wool, and making clothes. Women, in particular, carried a double burden, expected to work in the fields during critical periods, and also to manage the household, raise children, and produce textiles, all while enduring repeated pregnancies and the physical toll of childbirth. The total energy expenditure of a medieval peasant engaged in this kind of labor has been estimated at somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 calories per day for men, and somewhat less for women, though still well above modern sedentary levels. This explains why the diet, despite its monotony and its nutritional gaps, could provide enough energy to keep people working. The carbohydrates from bread, pottage, and ale were an efficient source of fuel for sustained physical labor, and the sheer volume of food consumed, up to 2 pounds of bread and large bowls of pottage per day, delivered the calories needed to maintain weight and muscle mass under these conditions. But it is important to recognize that this was a precarious balance. The diet provided just enough, in an average year, to meet the energy demands of the labor, and perhaps a small margin for growth in children, and for the body to repair and maintain itself. There was no excess, no cushion against a bad harvest or a period of illness when appetite might be suppressed or energy demands increased by fever. And the nutritional quality, as discussed earlier, was poor in many respects, with marginal protein, low fats, and seasonal deficiencies in vitamins and minerals. The fact that medieval peasants survived on this diet is less a testament to its adequacy than to the human body's remarkable ability to adapt to adversity, and to the fact that those who could not adapt simply did not live long enough to be counted in the historical record. Archaeological evidence from medieval skeletal remains provides some insight into what this diet and lifestyle did to the body over a lifetime. Studies of bones from medieval cemeteries have found that adult heights were generally somewhat shorter than modern averages, which is consistent with periods of malnutrition or illness during childhood that slowed growth. However, heights were not drastically reduced compared with other premodern populations, and in some periods and regions, medieval Europeans were not significantly shorter than people living in the early modern period, or even some populations in the 19th century, before modern nutrition and medicine improved dramatically. This suggests that, in good years and in regions with relatively stable food supplies, the medieval diet did provide enough for children to reach a reasonable adult stature, even if it was not optimal. Skeletal remains also show evidence of dental problems, with high rates of cavities, abscesses, and tooth loss, consistent with a diet high in coarse grains and poor dental hygiene. There is also evidence of diseases related to malnutrition, such as rickets, a condition caused by vitamin D deficiency that leads to soft and deformed bones, and signs of anemia visible in the bones as porotic hyperostosis and cribra orbitalia, conditions where the bone tissue becomes porous and spongy due to chronic iron deficiency. These findings confirm that many medieval people did suffer from nutritional deficiencies, but the fact that they survived to adulthood and lived long enough to leave skeletal remains also indicates that the deficiencies were not always immediately fatal. Life expectancy, of course, was much lower than today, but as noted earlier, this was heavily influenced by infant and child mortality. If a person survived to adulthood, they might live into their 50s or even 60s, though chronic health problems, including those related to diet and hard labor, would likely have made old age uncomfortable and limiting. Arthritis, back problems, hernias, and other conditions related to a lifetime of heavy physical work were common, and these, combined with the cumulative effects of poor nutrition, parasitic infections, and inadequate medical care, meant that even those who lived a relatively long life often did so in a state of declining health. For a modern person, the contrast is stark. Most people today, especially in developed countries, live sedentary or moderately active lives, consuming diets that are varied, nutrient-dense, and carefully regulated for safety. The idea of performing hard physical labor for 10 to 12 hours a day, every day, while eating only bread, pottage, and ale would be almost inconceivable. The body of someone who has grown up with adequate nutrition, with access to medical care, and without the conditioning of a lifetime of agricultural labor, is simply not adapted to those conditions. The muscles, bones, cardiovascular system, and metabolism are all tuned to a very different set of demands and inputs. Dropping such a person into the life of a medieval peasant, expecting them to eat the diet and perform the labor, would be a recipe for rapid physical breakdown. The high carbohydrate, low fat, low protein diet would leave a modern person feeling constantly hungry and unsatisfied, especially if they were used to meals that included significant amounts of meat, dairy, and fats. The lack of variety and the monotony of eating the same foods day after day would be psychologically difficult, and the absence of the vitamins and minerals that modern diets provide through fortified foods and diverse produce would lead to deficiencies that over months would manifest as fatigue, poor immune function, slow wound healing, and other problems. The physical labor, far beyond what most modern people are conditioned for, would initially cause extreme soreness, exhaustion, and possibly injury as muscles, tendons, and joints were subjected to stresses they were not prepared to handle. And the cumulative effect of inadequate nutrition and excessive physical demands will be a steady decline in health and capacity, a process that medieval peasants experienced gradually over their lifetimes, but that would hit a modern person with shocking speed. The medieval peasant diet worked for medieval peasants, but only in the narrowest sense of the word. It provided survival, not health. It supported life, but not thriving. And it depended on a way of living, a level of physical conditioning, and a tolerance for discomfort and suffering that are deeply alien to most people today. Understanding this helps us see why the same diet, transplanted to a modern context, would be so dangerous. But before we explore that final thought experiment in detail, it is worth noting that the medieval diet was not uniform across all of Europe, and that regional variations, driven by geography, climate, and culture, created different patterns of eating that, while sharing the same basic structure of grain dependence and occasional animal products, had their own distinctive features. Section 9. Regional variety and long-term chain. Although the picture painted so far has focused on a fairly typical medieval peasant diet from northern and western Europe, particularly England, it is important to recognize that the medieval peasant diet was not a single monolithic thing. Medieval Europe was a vast and diverse region, stretching from the cold forests of Scandinavia to the warm shores of the Mediterranean, and from the Atlantic coast of Ireland and Spain to the plains of Poland and the edges of the Byzantine world. Within this enormous area, climate, geography, agricultural practices, and cultural traditions all shaped what people ate, creating regional variations that could be quite significant even while the underlying pattern of heavy reliance on grains remained constant. In northern Europe, including England, Scotland, the Low Countries, northern France, and Germany, the climate was cool and wet, and the dominant grains were rye, barley, and oats, with wheat grown where conditions allowed. The three-field open field system described earlier was common, and the diet relied heavily on bread, pottage, ale, and root vegetables such as turnips and parsnips. Dairy products, particularly cheese and butter, were more common in pastoral regions where cattle and sheep could be grazed on pastures that were not suitable for grain cultivation. Herring and cod from the North Sea and the Baltic were the main sources of fish, and meat, when available, was mostly pork, with some beef and mutton. In southern Europe, around the Mediterranean, the climate was warmer and drier, and the agricultural system was different. Wheat was more widely grown and was the primary grain, often mixed with barley or other cereals. Olive oil, rather than butter or lard, was the main fat, and it was used in cooking and as a condiment. Wine, made from grapes grown in the warm climate, was the common drink, taking the place of ale in the north. Vegetables included more variety than in the north, with eggplants, artichokes, figs, and citrus fruits appearing in some areas, though these were often more accessible to wealthier households than to poor peasants. Fish from the Mediterranean, including sardines, anchovies, and various shellfish, were important sources of protein, and salted fish from the Atlantic, including cod, was imported and traded widely. In Eastern Europe, including regions that are now Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and parts of the Balkans, the diet again varied based on local conditions. Rye and barley were the main grains in many areas, and buckwheat, which could grow in poor soils and cold climates, was also cultivated in some regions. Dairy was important where herds could be maintained, and in some areas, particularly those influenced by Byzantine and Slavic traditions, different fermented milk products, such as forms of yogurt or kefir, were consumed. Preserved fish, including herring from the Baltic, was traded into these regions, but freshwater fish from rivers and lakes were also significant, especially in areas far from the sea. These regional differences meant that the specific flavors, textures, and nutrient profiles of peasant diets varied considerably. A peasant in southern France or Italy, with access to olive oil, wheat bread, and wine, had a diet that was somewhat higher in fats and possibly richer in certain vitamins than a peasant in northern England eating rye bread, turnip pottage, and ale. A peasant in a pastoral region of Scotland or the Alps, with more access to cheese and butter, had more dietary fat and calcium than one in a purely grain farming area. But despite these variations, the core pattern remained the same. The diet was dominated by cereals, supplemented by legumes and vegetables, with animal products appearing only occasionally and in small amounts. The regional differences were variations on a theme, not fundamental departures from it. Over the course of the medieval period, which spanned roughly 1,000 years from the fall of the Roman Empire in the West to the beginning of the Renaissance, the diet also changed gradually in response to technological and social developments. In the early Middle Ages, roughly the 6th to 10th centuries, agricultural productivity was relatively low, and the population was sparse. The two-field system, in which half the land was planted and half left fallow each year, was common, and yields were modest. As a result, the diet was likely even more marginal than in later periods, and famines and food shortages were frequent. Beginning around the 10th and 11th centuries, a series of agricultural innovations began to spread across Europe, gradually improving yields and supporting population growth. The heavy plough, with an iron ploughshare and a moldboard that turned the soil more effectively, made it possible to farm heavier, clay-rich soils that had been difficult to cultivate with earlier wooden ploughs. The three-field system, which increased the proportion of land under cultivation each year from half to two-thirds, raised overall production and also introduced more crop diversity, with spring-sown cereals and legumes supplementing the winter grains. The use of horses rather than oxen for ploughing, made possible by the development of the horse collar that allowed horses to pull heavy loads without choking, further increased efficiency in some regions. And improvements in milling technology, including the spread of water mills and later windmills, made it easier and faster to grind grain into flour. These changes did not transform the basic nature of the peasant diet, but they did make it somewhat more secure and varied. Higher yields meant that, in good years, there was more food to go around, and the risk of famine, while still ever present, was slightly reduced. The inclusion of legumes like peas and beans in the three-field rotation improved soil fertility through nitrogen fixation and also added a valuable source of protein to the diet. Population growth in the High Middle Ages, from roughly the 11th to the 13th centuries, was both a cause and a consequence of these improvements, as more people required more food, driving further expansion of cultivated land and intensification of farming. However, this period of growth also had its limits. By the late 13th and early 14th centuries, much of Europe was reaching the carrying capacity of its agricultural system. Most of the best land was already under cultivation, and further expansion required clearing marginal soils that were less productive. The population was large, and in many regions, peasant holdings had been subdivided among heirs to the point where individual families had too little land to support themselves adequately. The result was increasing vulnerability, and when the Great Famine struck in 1315 to 1317, followed by further climatic and agricultural crises in the following decades, the population began to decline. The Black Death, which arrived in 1347 and killed perhaps a third or more of Europe's population, was the most dramatic shock, and it fundamentally altered the social and economic landscape. In the aftermath of the Black Death, labor became scarce and wages rose, and this had a significant impact on the diet of those peasants and laborers who survived. With fewer people to feed and more resources per capita, food became more abundant and varied. Meat consumption increased as pasture land expanded at the expense of grain fields, and workers were able to demand better wages and conditions, including meals that featured more meat, fish, cheese, and ale. Records from the 15th century show that the diet of harvest workers and other laborers included significantly more animal protein than in the pre-plague period, a change that has been documented in both written records and in archaeological evidence from food remains. This late medieval improvement in diet was real, but it was unevenly distributed, benefiting wage laborers and some tenants more than the poorest and most vulnerable, and it did not fundamentally change the grain-based structure of the diet, only enriched it at the margins. So, while it is true that the medieval peasant diet varied by region, changed over time, and was somewhat better for some people in some periods than for others, the fundamental reality remained. It was a diet built on grains, limited in variety and nutritional quality, vulnerable to disruption, and capable of supporting life only when paired with hard physical labor and lifelong adaptation. For a modern person, these regional and temporal variations would matter little. Whether you were eating rye bread and turnips in England or wheat bread and olive oil in Italy, whether you were living in the relatively prosperous late 15th century or the crisis-prone early 14th century, the core challenge would be the same. A diet that is monotonous, nutritionally marginal, contaminated by pathogens and parasites, and utterly dependent on agricultural and social systems that you, as a modern person, would have no experience navigating. With all of this context in place, we are finally ready to answer the question directly. If you, a modern person, tried to eat like a medieval peasant, what would actually happen to you? Section 10. If you ate like a medieval peasant today. Imagine that you have been transporting back in time, or that you have decided, for reasons of historical curiosity or personal challenge, to eat exactly as a medieval peasant would have eaten, consuming only the foods that would have been available to them, prepared in the same ways, and in the same quantities, while also living under similar conditions of sanitation, hygiene, and physical labor. The question is simple. How long would you last, and what would happen to your body and health along the way? The answer, unfortunately, is that you would likely face serious problems surprisingly quickly, and that, without modern medical intervention, your chances of long-term survival would be much lower than you might expect. In the first days and weeks, the most immediate shock would be digestive. Your modern digestive system, accustomed to a varied diet that includes processed and refined foods, a wide range of fruits and vegetables, significant amounts of animal protein and fats, and relatively low levels of indigestible fiber, would suddenly be confronted with enormous quantities of coarse whole-grain bread, dense pottage made from barley and legumes, and little else. The sheer volume of fiber, including insoluble fiber from bran and cellulose from vegetables, would be far higher than what most modern people consume, and your gut would struggle to adjust. You would likely experience bloating, gas, cramping, and frequent bowel movements, possibly alternating with constipation as your intestines tried to process the heavy, dense food. If you were also drinking large quantities of weak ale, the mild alcohol content and the residual sugars and yeasts might contribute to further fermentation in your gut, adding to the discomfort. At the same time, you would be missing many of the foods your body is accustomed to. There would be no coffee or tea, no sugar except perhaps a rare taste of honey, no fresh fruit except in a brief window in late summer and autumn, no refined flour or baked goods in the modern sense, no dairy unless you happen to have access to a bit of cheese, and no meat or fish except on rare occasions. The psychological impact of this sudden loss of variety and of familiar comforts would be significant, contributing to feelings of deprivation, frustration, and low morale. Food is not just fuel. It is also pleasure, culture, and comfort, and the relentless monotony of bread and pottage, day after day, would wear on you mentally as well as physically. Within a few weeks, assuming you survived the initial digestive adjustment, you would begin to notice more subtle changes. If you were engaging in the kind of heavy physical labor that a medieval peasant performed, you might find that you were losing weight, despite eating large quantities of food, because the calorie quality and balance were not sufficient to maintain your body mass under those energy demands. If, on the other hand, you were living a more sedentary modern lifestyle while eating the medieval diet, you might maintain or even gain weight from the high carbohydrate intake, but you would still be facing nutritional deficiencies. Your energy levels would likely be low and unstable, spiking after meals of starchy pottage and bread, but then crashing as the glucose was used up and no sustained energy from fats or protein was available. After a month or two, vitamin and mineral deficiencies would begin to manifest. If you were eating this diet in winter or spring, when fresh vegetables and fruit were scarce, you would start to show signs of vitamin C deficiency. Your gums might become sore and bleed easily, small cuts and bruises would heal slowly, and you would feel increasingly tired and weak. Iron deficiency, especially if you were a woman of childbearing age, would lead to anemia, with symptoms including pallor, shortness of breath, dizziness, and profound fatigue that made even simple tasks exhausting. Calcium deficiency, if dairy was not part of your diet, could begin to weaken your bones, and vitamin D deficiency, especially in the long, dark winter months, would compound this, leading to bone pain and an increased risk of fractures. B vitamin deficiencies, while less likely given the whole grains in the diet, could still occur if your food was poorly prepared or if you were not absorbing nutrients properly due to gut problems. At the same time, the contamination and parasites in the food and water would be taking their toll. If you were drinking water that had not been boiled, or eating vegetables washed in contaminated water, or consuming meat or fish that had been improperly preserved, you would almost certainly be exposed to bacterial pathogens and parasitic eggs. Within weeks, you might develop intestinal parasites such as roundworm or whipworm. The initial infection might cause acute symptoms like diarrhea, nausea, and abdominal pain, but as the parasites established themselves, the symptoms would become chronic: persistent digestive discomfort, malabsorption of nutrients that would worsen your deficiencies, and a general sense of unwellness. Bacterial infections from contaminated food would cause repeated bouts of food poisoning, and each episode would leave you weaker, more dehydrated, and more vulnerable to the next infection. By 3 to 6 months, the cumulative effects would be severe. Your immune system, compromised by malnutrition and chronic parasitic infection, would be less able to fight off new threats. You would be more susceptible to respiratory infections, skin infections, and other illnesses that modern people usually recover from with little difficulty. Any injury, even a minor cut or scrape, will be at risk of becoming infected, and without antibiotics, such infections could become serious, leading to abscesses, sepsis, and potentially death. If you were a woman and became pregnant while on this diet, the risks would be even greater, as pregnancy places enormous nutritional demands on the body, and malnutrition greatly increases the risks of miscarriage, stillbirth, and maternal mortality during childbirth. If a bad harvest year occurred, and the food supply became even more limited, you would face the risk of outright starvation. Your body, already weakened by months of marginal nutrition, would have no reserves to draw on. You would lose weight rapidly, your muscles would waste away, and your organs would begin to fail as they were starved of the energy and nutrients they needed to function. Infections that you might have survived in better health would now be fatal. This is not a hypothetical scenario. It is what happened to countless people in the medieval period during famines, and it is what would happen to a modern person placed in the same situation. Even if you avoided famine, the long-term outlook would not be good. Chronic malnutrition, parasitic infections, and repeated illnesses would take years off your life expectancy and would make the years you did live far less healthy and comfortable than you are accustomed to. You would age faster, your bones would weaken, your teeth would decay and fall out, and you would likely develop chronic conditions related to the diet and lifestyle, such as arthritis, digestive disorders, and weakened immunity. The medieval peasant's life was hard, and the diet was a major part of why it was so hard. The key difference between you and a medieval peasant is adaptation. Medieval peasants were born into this diet and this lifestyle. Their bodies adapted from infancy, developing gut microbiomes that could handle the coarse grains and the contamination, immune systems that had been trained by repeated exposure to parasites and pathogens, and metabolisms that were tuned to extract every possible calorie from the limited food available. They did not thrive, but they survived, because they had no other choice, and because their entire way of life was built around this diet. You, on the other hand, would be starting from a very different baseline, with a body and immune system shaped by modern nutrition, modern sanitation, and modern medicine. You would have no adaptation, no childhood conditioning, no lifelong tolerance for the privations and dangers of the medieval food system, and that lack of adaptation would make all the difference. So, would you die eating a medieval peasant's diet? The answer depends on the details. If you were eating the diet under modern conditions, with access to clean water, modern sanitation, and medical care, you would likely survive, though you would suffer from deficiencies and discomfort and would need supplementation to avoid serious health problems. But if you were truly living as a medieval peasant, with medieval sanitation, medieval food safety, and no modern medicine, the risks would be very high. In a good year, you might survive for a while, though you would be chronically ill and malnourished. In a bad year, especially a famine year, your chances of death will be substantial. And over the long term, even if you avoided acute crises, the cumulative damage to your health would be severe and would significantly shorten your lifespan. The medieval peasant diet was not a healthy diet by any modern standard. It was a survival diet, the product of a world where food was scarce, choices were limited, and suffering was simply part of life. Medieval peasants endured it because they had to, and many of them did not endure it for long. For a modern person, the idea of voluntarily adopting such a diet is almost unthinkable, and the reality of doing so would be far harsher than most people imagine. It is a reminder of just how far we have come, how much our health and well-being depend on the abundant, varied, and safe food systems that modernity has built, and how fragile life was for the vast majority of people for most of human history. In the quiet of this moment, as you lie in your comfortable bed, with access to clean water, varied food, and medical care that would have seemed miraculous to a medieval peasant. It is worth reflecting on that history and feeling a deep gratitude for the progress that has been made, and a recognition of the resilience and endurance of those who lived and labored and suffered in the past, so that we, their distant descendants, might have a better life. Closing. Thank you for joining me tonight on this journey through the medieval village and the difficult realities of a peasant's diet. If you found this story calming, if it helped you learn something new while drifting off, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the Midnight Library. There are many more quiet historical stories waiting for you here, each one designed to ease you into sleep while expanding your understanding of the past. Rest well, and I'll see you in the next chapter.